Hello, everybody. My name is Julian Hay, and I'll be hosting the webinar for the WondrAcademy today. Thank you for taking your time. It's really appreciated. We have a really international audience. We've got 8 a.m. from the west coast of the USA all the way over to 4 p.m. UK time and a number of time zones in between. So thanks very much for your time. Really delighted to have Chip here today. Really appreciate your time, Chip. I know you've been incredibly busy. Not only is it the 10th anniversary of Peak, how great companies get their mojo from Maslow, but over that time you built the Joie de Vivre hospitality group in the downturn, which is what I think Peak is all about, really, and then sold it to the heir of the Hyatt Hotel dynasty. You wrote another bestseller. You worked as Airbnb's head of global hospitality and strategy, and now have gone on to be strategic advisor to the founders. I know you're finishing off a new book, which you might talk about later, and now you've just come off the back of a Latin American tour. So thanks so much for taking the time.
Well, I'm so glad to be with you.
No, I really appreciate it. So let me just talk to everybody about the running order. So after I stop talking, which will be in a few minutes time, Chip's going to present his latest Peak presentation, which is aligned with the 10th anniversary book, which will take around 20-25 minutes. And that will be followed by a question and answer. And we'll take as many questions as we can over the time that we've got. So I'm sure that some people are having a few technical difficulties. If you are unable to view myself or Chip at the moment, try altering the view at the top right of your screen. That might help. If you're having trouble with the sound, check your Zoom setup, which you can find on the bottom left corner of your screen. And if you're still struggling, maybe try and click on the link that was sent out in the Eventbrite confirmation email and try and load it up again, might help. Regarding questions, as Chip's presenting throughout, you can send us questions and we'll answer as many as we have time for, as I said. Please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen, rather than the chat function, which has been disabled, to make it super simple for everybody. So that's a Q&A. We'll then pick questions as we're going along, and we'll try and answer as many as we can as we have time after. So just shortly, so about the WondrAcademy. So we set up the WondrAcademy as a place for people to come and learn and share ideas about the understanding of peak performance and human potential. And why Peak really resonates with us is because we feel Peak is really a book about human potential, which Chip will talk about later, agree or disagree. But I think he'll agree. And I say that because in the early stages, it's very clear of the book, Chip talks about his journey from when he left Stanford, and he felt a bit disillusioned with the traditional workspace. And as I understand it, he really wanted to find a life and work that was joyful for not only himself but his employees, to make his customers ultimately happy. And if that all works, then have the success of happy investors too. And if you look at those three areas, they are really the three areas of the pyramid, the base, the middle, and the top of the relationship pyramid that has created that Maslow-inspired peak experience business that I think Chip successfully did at Joie de Vivre and wrote the book about. So, but I'll let him tell you more about that. So I'm going to pass over to Chip. We're just going to set up the PowerPoint presentation, and then Chip will call slide as we're going through it.
Thank you, Julian. Well, you know, first of all, welcome to everybody from wherever you're calling in around the world. One of the greatest joys for me in the last 10 years since this book got published has been to travel around the world and meet all kinds of people who both have read the book, but also, frankly, are living the principles of the book. And that's part of the reason my publisher asked me to write a 10th anniversary edition, which just came out a few weeks ago. I've been able to use Peak both in my own company, but also in other companies. And it's very inspiring to just see that the principles in this book work across all cultures. And during the Q&A, you're welcome to ask more about that, because some people have said, well, I can see Peak working in Europe and in the US, but maybe not in Latin America or Asia. But the truth is, I've just coming back from a Latin American tour speaking about the book, and it's very clear that they get it, and I've spent a lot of time in Asia as well. So let's go to the first slide. So as I think about the nature of business, and there are usually blind spots in business, in any company. And I think the most neglected fact in business is, next slide, please, the fact that we're all human. Now, why is that? I think it's partly because we as humans don't fit well on spreadsheets or on balance sheets. And it's often in thinking through a company's strategy, or just even comparing one company with another, the human capital side of things is harder to value, partly because it's harder to measure. And I gave a TED talk on this subject back in 2010. So if you go to the next slide, I think the thing that would help in terms of understanding how to not neglect that human factor is to imagine an operating system. And excuse me for using some tech lingo out here in San Francisco, but how do you figure out the operating system that helps you to understand humans? And that's really what I'm going to talk about today. Peak became my leadership lens. We can go to the next slide. It was the lens that allowed me in two different companies, a company that I started 30 years ago, Joie de Vivre, that became the second largest boutique hotelier in the US, as well as almost 5 years ago, when the three young founders of Airbnb asked me to join them to help create a world-class hospitality company. The truth is, in both cases, I've used this model that we're going to talk about today. Now, for those of you who are doubters, if you're a doubter, you're probably not calling in on this, but if you happen to be a doubter, I can just tell you that I've seen Latin America security companies using this. I've seen investment banks and Wall Street using this. I've seen advertising agencies in Milan using this. I've seen consumer products companies in Singapore using it. So it doesn't have to just be a hospitality model. It's a model that works for any company, assuming you have humans in the company. And at this point, we do. Maybe 10 or 20 years from now, with the robotics and AI, tsunami happening, this may be less of a relevant operating lens. Next slide. Just to give a little background, Joie de Vivre, the company I started when I was 26, grew it and ran it for 24 years, created 52 boutique hotels, almost exclusively in California. Next slide. And then Airbnb, you're probably even more familiar with, especially those in the UK or in Europe who are calling in on this. It's a global company in 192 countries with 4 million homes. When I joined Airbnb 5 years ago, we had a grand total of about 400,000 homes. So we've multiplied that by 10. We're also 25 times larger in terms of our revenues 5 years later. And I think part of that is due to Peak. I don't think that's the exclusive reason that Airbnb has grown to this size. But what's funny about this company is it started literally 8 or 9 years ago with 3 mattresses on a living room floor. And that's why it's called Air Bed and Breakfast, because it started with 3 mattresses on the founder's floor when a hotel conference in San Francisco, a conference in San Francisco was filling up all the hotels. Next slide, please. So I think, each of us, as we think about our operating model for how we run a business, has maybe an unspoken or a very tangible and intentional approach to how you run a business. As I grew Joie de Vivre in our early years, about 10 years into the company being in business, we had about 13 hotels at that point. And it was very clear that the model we used to get started needed to evolve. And I studied Southwest Airlines and something called the service profit chain. So this heart here, when sometimes I'm asked to go speak at various business schools and talk about what's the business strategy or the business model that we use, and I bring a heart and they laugh at me and say, no, show us the real one. And I said, no, this is it. This was verified empirically at the Harvard Business School more than 30 years ago. The service profit chain is based upon the following premise. If you create a unique corporate culture, it will drive happiness and enthusiasm and passion amongst your staff. If your staff is happy, and it's a service business especially, you're more likely to create strong customer loyalty, which means that you'll grow market share, which means number 4, the lagging indicator of your success is your profitability, and that creates a sustainable business model such that you can invest back in the culture. So John Mackey from Whole Foods Markets called this the virtuous cycle. And I think that's really what it is. It says that you start with the culture and you invest in that, and the payoff is later. Now, why doesn't every business do this? Well, part of the reason that some people have a hard time with this is because if you're investing in one, knowing that the ultimate payoff is 4, the profitability, the question is how quickly does that happen? And for a company that might be a public company investing such that they are looking for quarterly returns to change, it often takes a year or 2 or 3 years' time to see the effect of 1, 2, and 3, such that 4 shows market share growth and then profitability growth. So for some companies, they're not patient. And so I want to be clear on the front end, for people who are not patient, this model may not be perfect for them. But generally speaking, I've seen both public and private companies make it work. So I call this karmic capitalism because it's what goes around comes around. Next slide, please. So this is the dark slide. So if you see a black slide right now, that's accurate. There's nothing supposed to be shown here, because I'm going to tell you my tawdry, sad tale that led me to understanding why Maslow's hierarchy of needs became my model. So I started the company Joie de Vivre, means joy of life. That was our mission statement. There are very few companies in the world whose mission statement is also the name of the company. And then the company grew really quickly. And by around 2001, we were 14, 15 years old. We had 21 hotels around the San Francisco Bay Area. We were the largest hotelier in the San Francisco Bay Area, which during the prior few years had been a really good thing. It was during the dot-com boom. But then the dot-com boom went to being a bust, and then we had 9/11, which after 9/11, nobody wanted to jump on a plane anytime soon. And then we had a recession, we had wars, we had SARS, such that travel to the Bay Area from Asia basically stopped for about 10 months. And so the company that I had created, Joie de Vivre, and the spirit that I'd tried to imbue into the company started to atrophy, because all of a sudden we were seeing double-digit revenue drops for our hotels. And since all of our hotels were in this one market, the Bay Area, which was getting hit harder than any other market in the United States, because it's the tech market and tech was sort of going into a depression, I was in a lot of trouble. And frankly, I could say that I was emotionally maybe going into a depression. Interesting to see that the word we use for an economy can also be applied to our emotions. Well, for me, I realized I needed to find a clue. And I decided to go to a local bookstore that no longer exists, the Borders bookstore at Union Square in San Francisco. And I went to the business section of the bookstore with the intent of finding a book, maybe a book that I had read long ago in business school, or a book that actually would help me to figure out how do you save a company that's in a sort of a death spiral. And after about 10 minutes in the business section of the bookstore, I realized my problem was more serious than that. So I went to the psychology and self-help section of the bookstore. You've called your company Joie de Vivre and you're not feeling a whole lot of joy. I guess that's part of the reason I ended up in that part of the bookstore. And that's literally when I got reacquainted with Abraham Maslow and his books, because they were there in the psychology section. So I sat down for 2 hours on the floor of Borders bookstore, and I read through two of Maslow's different books. I only took one psychology class in college. But I remember Maslow was the guy, next slide please, who had created this hierarchy of needs and had said, what a man can be, he must be. This is this need we call self-actualization. It refers to man's desire for self-fulfillment, to become everything one is capable of becoming. Now, that sounded really inspiring, especially for a guy, me, who is actually wondering how I was going to help my company get out of this death spiral. Next slide, please. So I went back to studying Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And for those of you, I think most of you probably are familiar with this, but maybe some of you aren't. This is one of the iconic psychology theories of the 20th century. Maslow was really probably one of the first, at least the first famous psychologists to say, why are we focused on worst practices in human behavior? Why don't we focus on best practices? And that makes sense for me in business. You know, in business, we can look at companies that have failed, but sometimes the best lessons are also from the companies that have succeeded. And so similarly, if we apply that theory to humans, why not focus on humans who are flourishing? So Maslow went out and studied 1,000 humans, some who were living back in the 1940s and 50s, and some who had passed away and from long ago. And he ended up creating this hierarchy. Now, to be clear, the hierarchy is not lockstep. You don't have to get to 100% of physiological needs then to go to safety. You need to actually have most of a need met, a physiological need met, water, food, sleep, air, to make it to the next level, which means that you can frankly go from physiological to safety to social belonging relatively quickly if you are middle class or upper class. If you're actually not in that position and you're really in a very challenged position financially, you really do end up at the base of this pyramid and in a survival mode. But further up the pyramid, you have the social and belonging needs on the third level, esteem needs on the fourth, and then at the top of the pyramid is self-actualization, or where Maslow said peak experiences happen, which is part of the reason I called my book Peak. And just to be clear, some people think, oh, that was all about self-absorption. No, Maslow later in his life had a 7-level pyramid and an 8-level pyramid that focused on self-transcendence. So his idea about self-actualization was not just being all you can be, but it was being all you can be for a cause greater than yourself. All right, next, let's go to the next slide. So this is what I translated Maslow's 5-level pyramid into, because it felt like there's three basic paradigms in life. There's survival, which is the first 2 levels of Maslow's pyramid. There's a sense of having success in life, which often happens to do with our social sense of how we connect with other people and our own esteem. And then there's this sense of being transformed. And so survival, succeed, transform is what I call the transformation pyramid. So at the bottom of the downturn, I said to my senior executive team at Joie de Vivre, if we're going to go and fail, let's fail famously, and let's do it by actually trying to apply this theory in a way that could be transformative to our company. Because the truth is, when you go into recession, most companies get very fixated at the bottom of the pyramid. And most employees feel anxiety because they're not sure if they're going to have a job next week or next month. So we figured, okay, how do we actually get the base of the pyramid right and then apply it to the other 2 levels as well? And we decided to apply this transformation pyramid to our 3 key stakeholders: our employees, our customers, and investors. And that's what I'm actually going to show you now. Next slide, please. So this is the employee pyramid. This is, to me, fundamental. If you go back to that service profit chain and you say culture drives employee satisfaction and enthusiastic employees, my belief is, I'm going to quote the former CEO of Southwest Airlines, and that is that the customer comes second. It's the employees who come first. And I think that's very true in a service industry, because how can you expect customers to feel great love and affection from your team if you're not actually providing much recognition or a sense of meaning or any kind of love to your employees? So the employee pyramid is money, recognition, and meaning. And that actually interestingly translates to job, career, and calling. These are the 3 kinds of relationship you can have with your work. And it tends to create this, the base level of motivation is money, and then loyalty is created through recognition, and inspiration happens higher up the pyramid. Now, a little bit later in this talk, I'm going to apply this to Airbnb, and I'm also going to talk about some of the new learning I've had in the last 10 years related to this in terms of some leadership practices as well. But suffice it to say, I think that the differentiator here, and with all 3 of these pyramids, the employee, the customer, and the investor pyramid, is usually higher up the pyramid. At the base of the pyramid is the commodity. As you move up the pyramid, it's harder and harder to get there. And it's frankly harder to measure things. Things at the base of the pyramid tend to be tangible. Things at the peak tend to be intangible. And that's why, frankly, again, most companies get very fixated at the base, because you can measure whether employees are satisfied, whether they feel like they're getting the proper compensation, etc. But it is when you create an environment that people feel a sense of meaning, that they feel the sense of inspiration and calling, and they almost feel like they'd work in your company even if they weren't getting paid. So let's talk about that a little bit further. Next slide. Let's talk about the fact that I'm going to give you 3 examples right now. 3 different employees. Next slide, please. Or actually, you're going to morph, and there's going to be a second, and then let's morph to a third. So we have 3 different employees right now. These are 3 hospitality employees. You have someone on the front desk at the far left. You have someone in the housekeeping department in the middle. And you have somebody who's a bartender on the right. So why am I showing you this? It's partly because one of the interesting fallacies that I've seen in the 10 years since Peak came out is that many companies think that meaning is something that's sort of commoditized across all job classifications. And that's not true. I think what we found at Joie de Vivre is that various kinds of employees found meaning in different kinds of ways. So great companies, from my perspective, not only help to create that employee pyramid that help people move from money to recognition to meaning, but they recognize that within their company, certain job classifications get meaning in different ways. For example, on the far left, you've got someone at the front desk. What we found is that the people at our hotels on the front desk, the thing that they really gave them a sense of meaning is when they knew that they were doing things that made them feel appreciated from the customers. So one of the things we did in the downturn, and it cost 0 money, is we actually asked our customers once a month, if we had a staff meeting, we would ask our customers to come in and talk at a staff meeting. Someone could be staying, from London, staying at one of our hotels, and they're there frequently. So while they're in town, why not have them come to your staff meeting with everybody together, and then have that guest, who's a loyal guest, talk about why they love your hotel so much. And it was an easy way for us to help address the sense that when an employee feels they have a sense of impact, it helps them feel like the work they do is important. And so that's one example. The middle example, the housekeeping staff, the number one thing that actually gave them a sense of meaning was their connection with each other. Most of our housekeeping staff are immigrants. About 90% of the housekeeping staff actually came to the U.S. and is actually working in the U.S. from somewhere else. So there can be a bit of a sense of a lack of community. One place they could have more community is with the other housekeeping staff, frankly, usually from other parts of the world. So the housekeeping staff at many of our hotels were creating a monthly potluck that actually allowed them to bring the food from their home country and share it with their community, the housekeeping community at lunchtime. Well, we did everything we could to foster more of that. We really saw that it was working well in those hotels that were doing it. And so what we did is we took an idea that worked in one place, and we said across all of our hotels, how can we help all of our hotels create an environment where the housekeeping staff can feel like they can give a potluck to each other at least once a month. And then following the last person here is the bartender. Now let's be clear, bartenders can be somewhat mercenary. They can be prickly and fun, but they're often just sort of doing their own thing. And they like to actually work in a bar, not because they get a generally very low wage associated with it. They make their money on the tips. So what was it that actually gave a sense of meaning to our bartenders when we actually interviewed and talked with them? And that's really how we got to this, is talking to our staff, is we found that bartenders love the fact that we have a lot of hotels in the company. And for bartenders who are doing a great job, we encourage them to go and stay for 2 nights free once a quarter at any of our hotels. So what we wanted to do during that downturn is amplify something we were already offering, but get more clear that it's available to everybody. And a lot of our bartenders actually didn't even know they had that as a perk available to them. So my point here is you can focus on the peak of this pyramid, but recognize that what's going to give meaning to one set of employees in your company may be different than for another set of employees. And you might actually have to modify the perks in such a way to actually make it meaningful to different types of job classifications. Next slide, please. All right, let's move to the customer pyramid. Now, the customer pyramid is where a lot of magic happens, there's no doubt, because if you get the expectations right, you have a satisfied customer. And in the pre-internet world, that meant you probably had a loyal customer. But in the internet world we live in now, we have promiscuous customers, which means that customers have more choices than ever before, because all they have to do is go click on the internet and find out who else they can go to. So just creating expectations, meeting expectations, is a survival need for a customer, and frankly doesn't necessarily create a great loyalty. But you can move it up one level and you address the desires of a customer and you create a more committed customer. But the magic here happens at the peak of the pyramid. And the peak of the pyramid is where we address a customer's unrecognized needs. Now that sounds very psychological. How do you mind read a customer to understand their unrecognized needs? Well, if you do it well, you create evangelism. And let's start by thinking, who are companies out there in the world that you're an evangelist for, or that your friends are an evangelist for? Truly, if you actually start to list some of those companies, you will find that they're not just meeting expectations, they're tending to actually doing something higher up the pyramid. In fact, Apple is usually one of the first companies that's mentioned here. And Steve Jobs was quite famous for saying that at Apple, they will never do focus groups, because to translate it to this pyramid, the focus group will only get you to the desires of the customer, not to their unrecognized needs. And Henry Ford said long ago when he started the Model T, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So the question is, how do you address an unrecognized need for a customer? Well, let me show you a video first, and then I'll explain that. Next slide. So the reason I show that video is a couple of reasons. Number one is almost a year ago during the Super Bowl here in the U.S., the football, the big, it's almost like a national holiday, frankly, in the U.S. Everybody's watching the Super Bowl, and they're watching the ads on the Super Bowl. And last minute, Airbnb, the company I've worked for the last 5 years almost, decided to put up that ad. And this ad, which the Super Bowl happened about a week after President Trump's inauguration. Part of the reason we did this is because we wanted to send a message politically to the world and to the US that the idea of raising borders was not necessarily congruent with the belief system and of the Airbnb community and the Airbnb leaders. And so that's why we created this. Now, how does that relate to the customer pyramid? One of the things that I've learned along the way is a beautiful exercise that you could do in your company. And it's called, What Business Are We In? And it started from, again, Theodore Levitt, who was a professor at Harvard Business School, who said it, and then Peter Drucker, probably the most famous management theorist of all time, popularized it. And he said, why don't you ask yourself the question, what business are you in? So we took that idea, and this, by the way, this is in the book Peak, but it's something you could do starting tomorrow. The way we used it at Joie de Vivre is we did an exercise, and then we did this at Airbnb as well. And the exercise is having two people sit in front of each other. One of them is asking the question, one of them is answering it. And that first person says to the second person, what business are we in? And the second person then describes what business they're in. So in the case of Airbnb, when we did this exercise, the question that, and we did this with our senior leadership team, so there were 12 of us, so there's 6 teams of 2. So the first answer that a person would tend to say about what Airbnb's business is we're in the home sharing business. We're the global leader in home sharing. Okay, that's fine. The person who asked that question then says, thank you. And then they ask the question again, what business are we in? And then the second time, that this person who's answering the question cannot answer the same way. You actually have to come up with a new answer, which forces you to go a little deeper. Okay, we're in the global home sharing, but we're in the business of helping people feel like a local, anywhere in the world. Okay, thank you. And now we go to the third one, and then we go to the fourth, and then we go to the fifth. I promise you, if you do this exercise, by the time you get to the 5th, you will get clear on what is your secret sauce. What's the differentiator? What's the essence of your business? This exercise led to Joie de Vivre realizing that we were in the identity refreshment business, and you'll read about that in Peak if you already haven't. And in the case of Airbnb, it helped us to realize we are in the business of helping people belong anywhere. Belong anywhere. And ultimately, that's what we figured out was at the top of the pyramid. That was the unrecognized need of our customer, is to actually feel like they can go anywhere. I mean, Airbnb is in 65,000 cities in 192 countries. There's absolutely no other hospitality company that can say that. So we are anywhere. And what we try to do is create the environment where people can feel like they're connected locally with a host and in a residential neighborhood, etc. So belong anywhere became our unrecognized need we tried to address. Next slide. And then finally, the investor pyramid. I'll be very brief on this. The survival need is transactional alignment, which really speaks to the idea that you are on the same page with your investors. You have the same definition of what you're trying to accomplish. The relationship alignment is when you actually have a relationship with your investors such that they feel like they would invest in you again in a different business. And then a legacy investor, frankly, is someone who's investing their money to put their money where their heart is. And they have a pride of ownership around that. Next slide. So this is the 3 slides all together. Employees at the left, customer on the top, and investor on the bottom. So it all fits together. Years and years ago, I didn't know what should be in the middle of this pyramid, and somebody called it out and told me when I was giving a speech. And next slide, you'll see that what we talked about earlier, the service profit chain, and the idea of what we called the Joie de Vivre heart, which we created in 1997, ultimately went into this peak pyramid in 2003. And what's interesting about this is that point number 1 on the heart, the unique corporate culture, is like the blood pumping from there. Point number 2 on the heart is the enthusiastic staff, which is right next to the employee pyramid. And then there's the customer pyramid directly above that, next to the customer loyalty part, and then the profitable and sustainability part. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Actually, let's beat the heart first. There you go, the beating heart. The heart helps to create a holistic system that allows these 3 pyramids to come together. Next slide. So these are a bunch of companies that actually now use Maslow in their customer or employee strategy. Next slide. And for those of you who are doubting and think, well, this all sounds like this guy named Chip talking to Joie de Vivre in San Francisco, he's like a hippie. You know, he's a hippie hotelier. You know, most companies can't operate this way. Well, guess what? 5-6 years ago, the Harvard Business Review did a whole issue, January-February issue of 2012, exclusively focused on exactly what we're talking about. The fact that employee well-being drives profits. It's not that being successful creates a happy company. It's actually a happy company, a peak-minded company creates success. And it's usually driven by culture. Next slide. So this led me to writing the new edition. This is the new edition of Peak, the 10th anniversary edition, and Peak Experiences Create Peak Performance. And that's really what we're all about. Next slide, please. So there are 8 leadership practices I want to just talk about. There's a whole chapter in the book that didn't exist in the last book. So the book has all kinds of new examples from companies like Facebook and WeWork, and Pinterest, etc. But there are 8 leadership practices late in the book that talk about the way that a peak leader embodies these principles is in this way of practice. So first, and I'll do these quite quickly because you can read it in the book in the new edition. First is to embody an inherently positive view of human nature. If you have a basic point of view that your employees are lazy or have to be bribed to do their job well, this whole model won't work for you. So you have to have a basic sense that the idea of self-actualization and human potential means that you create the conditions for people to do their best work, which leads you to the second practice, which is creating the conditions for people to live their calling. If you don't think that people in your company are have the possibility of living your calling, you probably aren't going to make this model won't work for you. On the other hand, if you realize that, frankly, great companies turn that pyramid of job, career, calling to maybe a square, such that there are as many people having a calling as a job, then they're more likely to actually find that this model works for them. Thirdly, in order for you to really believe in the peak model, you have to accept that at the base of the pyramid is usually very tangible. Just think about Maslow's pyramid: water, food, and sleep. You can say almost in an exact metric how much you've gotten of each in the last 24 hours. But if you ask yourself the question, was I self-actualized in the last 24 hours? That's a harder question to answer. And similarly, that's part of the reason why a lot of companies don't move up that pyramid, because you move from the tangible to the intangible. So the key, I think, in life, and this is part of the reason I went to Bhutan to study their gross national happiness index, is to actually look at how you can start studying and measuring the things that are intangible in life. Fourth is move fluidly between being a transactional versus and a transformational leader. Transactional leaders operate at the base of the pyramid, and it's a perfectly fine place to be. So for those of you thinking, well, this is all about transformation, if you don't get the base of the pyramid right, you can't move up the pyramid. But the best leaders I know of are able to understand at what times in their company's history do they actually have to be in the trenches, making sure that the trains are running on time, and then when are they thinking much more transformationally at the peak of the pyramid. Next slide, please. 5 is nurture and value and evolve your corporate culture as your ultimate differentiator. That's really what the service profit chain is all about, that joie de vivre heart. Number 6 is calibrating the difference between being conscious and capitalism. So conscious capitalism is a phrase that John Mackey from Whole Foods Markets came up with. And the truth is that there's going to be certain times where being conscious and being a capitalist will be at odds with each other. And therefore, the key is to figure out how do you calibrate the balance there. And I think peak leaders are able to do that. Again, the book goes into much more detail about this. 7 is disrupting the customer pyramid with innovations at the peak. And the reality there is, this is where what business are you in question? What is it that what business would your customers like you to be in? Apple was a computer company, but I would say today Apple is as much a lifestyle curator as they are a technology company. And so I think the idea of your evolution and your disruptive thinking about where you're going has a lot to do with moving to the top of the pyramid. Because here's another fact about that customer pyramid. What was an evolution or an innovation or a disruption 5 years ago has now become an expectation. This is the truth of innovations, is you have an innovation. For me, I travel a lot. And back in the 4 or 5 years ago, when I was on a plane that had Wi-Fi, it was like, really? I can actually do some things. Now, in some cases, I didn't want to have Wi-Fi on the plane. I sort of liked sleeping or reading a book. But actually, I've gotten used to having Wi-Fi on the plane. So it went from being an unrecognized need I didn't think I could ever have met to actually becoming an expectation. So you have to then come up with a new innovation. And then finally, you need to lead to the peak. You're always a role model, and you're a bit of a Sherpa, which means that you're helping people move up this pyramid. Next slide, please. So the funny thing, we're just finishing up now, and now we're going to go to Q&A, is ever since I've started reading Maslow again, which was many years ago now, 18 years ago, I have started to see everything looks like a pyramid to me, including this peak that we see in front of us. And that's partly because you could look at anything in life and say, what's the survival need? What's the succeed need? And what's the transformation need? You could think of a family, vacation that way. You could think of a date this Saturday night, or you could think of your company this way. And I've now had the opportunity to disrupt the hospitality industry twice, once as a boutique hotelier and once as an Airbnb leader. And I've found that this pair of glasses, where everything looks like a peak, worked for me. So I hope it works for you as well. And now let's open it up for Q&A. Thank you, Julian.
Thanks, Chip. That was enlightening, especially for somebody who's read the book twice. So have you got a bit of time? Do you need a bit? You need
absolutely.
Okay, brilliant. I'm just going to fire some questions at you, if that's all right.
Sure.
So the first question is, and this is probably for a lot of our British audience or those outside the US, is the book is called How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow. So what for you is mojo?
Yeah.
In the book, you say it's a secret ingredient that gives life and vitality to your organization. But was that for joie de vivre? What is it different for Airbnb, or is there a sort of an underpinning characteristics of mojo for multiple organizations?
Yeah. So the way I would say that is, so if you want to translate mojo, which is almost a Creole word, it comes from the New Orleans area, and you could call it magic. And mojo and magic sound similar. So magic is generally, there's certain things that are magical for anybody. Feeling, self-actualized and that timeless sense of being in the flow is magical. But I think for a company, magic really comes back to their culture. So what would be magical in one culture might be when that culture is living up to its potential as a culture. What does it look like? For joie de vivre, there were 5 adjectives we would use to describe the culture on a good day. For me, it was about how you create that sense of, tangible joy that our employees and our customers had. So that was for joie de vivre, what it was. I think for Airbnb, it was a little bit more mission-led in the sense that it was, how do we as a company help create a friendlier world where strangers are turning into friends? That is, so I think the mojo can be quite specific to your culture and maybe the mission of the organization.
And connecting it to the behaviors.
And connected to the behaviors, for sure. I mean, mojo, the key is that mojo, that magic, is helping your employees operate in a way that's effectively accomplishing the strategic goals of the company as well. So this is not just about having people feel good. Yeah. It's actually influencing behaviors.
Okay, thank you. A question that we've got: have you read all those books behind you? And and would you give, what book recommendations would you give?
Wow. Okay, so I wish I could. Yeah, I'll show you around I got lots of books over there and over there on the ground, and I'm lucky enough that as an author I get sent a lot of books. I have about 3,500 books in my home here, of which I've read fully about a third of them. I've read, and skimmed about a third, and then about a third I've never opened yet. So I have a lot ahead of me. The good news, first of all, in Peak, at the end of each chapter, I give a list of my recommended books specific to that chapter, which I think is very helpful, because generally what you see in a lot of books is you have a bibliography at the end, but it doesn't necessarily translate to what I want to know more about recognition. So literally I have at the end of the chapter on recognition, more books on that. What have I loved recently? I've been working on a new book, and so I've been looking at other books that are new. Let me see. I will tell you. Here's a book that I liked. Funny enough, the question comes up: The Art of Possibility. So this is a book written by Rosamund Zander with her husband Benjamin Zander. It is mentioned in Peak, but I'm actually looking at it also for my new book called Wisdom at Work: The Making of a Modern Elder. Why do I like that book? Well, Ben Zander was the conductor of, I think, the Boston Philharmonic, if I'm not mistaken, and between he and his wife, they really speak to the idea of how do you create an environment where people actually, not only on a personal basis, feel that sense of meaning and feel that sense of living up to their potential, but they do it collaboratively amongst a group. Now, for a composer, I'm sorry, not a composer, a conductor of an orchestra, absolutely essential. So I would just say that's one of my favorite books I've read. I've read it once or twice before, and I've just read it again recently.
Okay, can I just, on that, I thought it was really, really helpful at each chapter you having multiple books that you read, but there's probably across the book maybe 40 plus books that you read. Was that very intense period when you were going through the downturn, you just absorbed all this information? Because that's what it felt like, that you absorbed all this information to turn the business around, or was it over a long period of time that those books?
No, that was the books. Yeah, there's probably on average about 6 to 8 per chapter, and there's 15 chapters now, so it's like over 100 books even. I'd say 75% of those books I read during that really difficult time of 3 years. Let's call it a 3-year difficult time. Now, just so everybody knows, a lot of you don't know this, that difficult time, joie de vivre, when revenues in the San Francisco Bay Area hotel market went down 35%, in Silicon Valley it went down 50%. Joie de vivre during that period tripled in size in terms of our average revenues over about a 5-year period. Now, part of that was the acquisition of new hotels, but part of it was we just were doing so well relative to our competitors, because instead of being stuck at the bottom of the pyramid and focusing on survival, we actually focused on that to make sure that we got up to the transformation piece too.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question: can you start a business culture first versus product first? can you have the passion, not the product, and develop the product out of the passion?
Yes, I think the question that and the product, we can talk about product either online, sort of a digital product, or offline, a physical product. I think the real question that comes up as a result of thinking is, what is it that the customer really wishes existed, even if it didn't exist yet? And so, in terms of your own passion, as you're thinking about this, if you're the passion, Richard Branson wrote the foreword to my first book, the Virgin founder, and he said that when he's creating a new business, he always said the following: the mantra he had in his head was, "I am the market. I am the market. I am the market." So the question you might want to ask yourself is, what would make you passionate as a customer if somebody offered you fill in the blank? And so I do think that level of passion as a customer is important in terms of translating that into a business strategy. I mean, sometimes people think, gosh, I'm going to go start a business, and I'm going to go out and see what's the most practical business for me to start based upon what all these articles say. And then they go out and try to start a business that they don't really care that much about, nor do they have much passion for a customer around that product. And, if you're going to work as an entrepreneur and, put in 60 to 80 hours a week, which is sort of typical, you better do it on a subject that actually gets you excited.
But at the beginning of your book, you wrote that you were slightly disillusioned with the work you were doing. I
was a commercial real estate developer.
Yeah, but you then, as I understand it, you went into the hospitality industry and hotels because it gave you the canvas to be creative, as in you were literally painting the hotel and designing the hotel. So you were sort of creating the self-actualization through your business. Was it that way around? You were looking at and thinking, I don't know what to do here, but this gives me the outlet.
Yeah, it's a great question, Julian. I mean, I was very clear that I knew I was young. I was 25 or 26 when I decided to start the company. I'd had a few years of experience in commercial real estate, so I understood commercial real estate development. But general commercial real estate development of building warehouses or office buildings or even apartment buildings didn't feel creative enough to me. Hotels felt more creative. And then as I studied hotels, I realized the boutique hotel segment of the hotel industry was just getting launched in the US in the mid-1980s. So that gave me the interest to say, gosh, I can take some of my real estate knowledge, which is bread and butter. That's, in fact, if you were to looking at a pyramid for Chip and his path, the bread and butter was understanding real estate, which hotels are part of real estate. But the part that actually got me excited and was transformative was the idea of creating these boutique hotels, each of which was very unique and individualized. And I got very involved in the design and concepting of them. So you could apply Peak to even your career aspirations.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, new question. What are your suggestions to establish the customer's unrecognized need?
So let me tell you how we did it at Joie de Vivre. And this is in the book, but I just think it's my favorite chapter in the book is chapter 9. Chapter 9 is the book on unrecognized needs. So for those of you who want to just say, I don't have time to read a whole book, just read chapter 9. Because that's the chapter that's the longest chapter as well, and actually goes into quite a bit of detail about how to do this. But let me give you my own story from Joie de Vivre. when we created the first hotel at Joie de Vivre, it was called the Phoenix, and we knew it was going to be a rock and roll hotel. It was a motel in a bad neighborhood. We sort of felt like only visiting traveling bands would want to stay there, and so we tried to come up with a concept for how we were going to get clear about what the personality of this hotel would be. And our first meeting was really ill-fated. The collection of 7 of us in a room, we could not come to an agreement on anything. So for the next meeting, I said to the 7 people in the room who were organizing, what this hotel was going to be, next time you come to our next meeting, bring a magazine that defines the personality of the hotel that we're aspiring to create. And so 5 of the 7 people in the next meeting came with the same magazine, which was Rolling Stone magazine. And so we said, yeah, that makes sense. Rolling Stone is funky, irreverent, adventurous, cool, and young at heart. And so we came to the conclusion that we would use those 5 adjectives to create the concept, the decor, the kind of staff we hired, the kind of restaurant we would have, the kind of unique services we offered, in such a way that people could feel the soul of the hotel. Now, the magic here, and this is to get to your question, the magic here was not that it just helped to create a very soulful, holistic concept of a hotel that was unique. What we came to realize is that the people who fell in love with that hotel thought the hotel was a mirror for their aspirations of themselves. So we were creating what I call identity refreshment. By someone staying at the Phoenix, 3 days later, they felt a little bit more funky and irreverent. And for certain people in the population, that was valuable. For my mom, it wasn't. That's not her kind of place. So this became a shorthand way of understanding the psychographic, not the demographic. The psychographics is what we feel like on the inside. The psychographic of our core customer is once we realized that our differentiating competency as a company versus other hoteliers was to create this identity refreshment. Every one of our 52 hotels had either 1 or sometimes a combination of 2 magazines and 5 adjectives and that mirror of identity refreshment. So that helped us to understand that when we created the Hotel Vitale in the financial district of San Francisco, we created the first financial district hotel in the world that had a yoga studio in it because that hotel was modern, urbane, fresh, natural, and nurturing. And it fit the psychographic. So to summarize, it's really important. You don't have to do magazines. And frankly, sometimes we didn't even use magazines. We used celebrities. We had a hotel that was Gwyneth Paltrow meets Harrison Ford. And we came up with 5 adjectives to define their love child. And so the bottom line is, key is to get to a place where you have a precision of understanding the core customer. And if you can get to that place where you really can almost imagine what that person is like and what they would like to see, it gets a lot easier.
Is what you just said the more tangible way of creating values in a business? The values, culture, behavior. You just did it in a real way rather than sticking a load of words on the wall.
Yeah, I did it in a real way. I would say that, no, I don't think that that's necessarily, I mean, I think that ideally the values of a company are going to be congruent with what I just described. But I think the values of a company are the wallpaper that you exist within. And the thing I just described was a little, within that wallpaper, there's something going on. But I think the values are almost like operating principles for and they're really an editing function. I mean, yes, Julian, where I love your mind. What you just described was this 5 adjectives became an editing function for us as we were creating things. Like the designer says, we're going to use these bedside lamps. No, those bedside lamps don't look funky, irreverent, adventurous, cool, young at heart. Not any of those.
Yeah.
Very few things are all of them. So it became an editing function, and core values are an editing function. It helps an organization say yes or no to things. And that's really, frankly, one of the most important things for most companies is learning what to say no to. And then what to say an enthusiastic yes to.
Okay, thank you. We're going to try and squeeze in a few more. Is the Maslow pyramid relevant to non-service industries like manufacturing? You might have answered it in one of your slides, but I'm sure it gets asked a lot, that question.
It's a great question. And 2/3 of the world's GDP today is in the service industry, which includes technology. And so manufacturing and agriculture are a smaller piece of it. But I've seen manufacturing companies make it work. Why? Partly because the culture of an organization is important no matter what the organization is. Now, if the organization is fully just robots, then that doesn't matter. But in an environment where you have, a BMW plant, where they're building cars, combination of robots and humans, still in that environment, in manufacturing, there's an environment, there's an element where the unit of labor you get from the person who is inspired by what they're doing is going to be a much better unit of labor than the unit of labor you get from the person who is completely disengaged. So I think that's just true across all industries. I do think it's more valuable in service industries. Okay,
thank you. Okay, new question. Good morning, Chip. What were some of the obstacles you encountered when introducing Peak to Airbnb, and how did you and the leaders there overcome them?
Here's the great news is that some of the leaders and the founders had actually already read Peak before I ever joined the company. So part of the reason that they reached out to me, I'm a hospitality leader. I'm based in San Francisco. Airbnb is based in San Francisco. I'm a bit of an innovative thinker, which Airbnb was an innovation and a disruption to the industry. But it helped that they understood the language. And as one person, a senior leader, said to me, what you described in the book, nobody had ever described in a book the way I operate and the way I think about how a company should be. So you actually put in words how I, in my mind, imagine how I want to be as a leader. So that helped. So we took Peak, and I joined the company April of 2000. I met with Brian, the CEO, co-founder, in March 2013, joined in April 2013. And then by September, just 5 months later, we did a full 3-day offsite retreat in New York with our senior leaders. It focused on Peak and having Peak be the influencer of how we were going to determine our strategic initiatives for 2014. So it was pretty fundamental. And if you walk around the whiteboards of Airbnb, you see a lot of pyramids on the wall. And so I was lucky. I was fortunate that it was already part of the DNA of the organization.
Do you think we can squeeze in 2 more?
Sure.
Okay. Why do you think the idea that the right culture is good for the bottom line can be so difficult to land in long-established businesses?
I think the longer you've been around, the more resistant to change you can often be. And so therefore, any kind of new model, not just Peak, but any kind of new model can be difficult to digest. That's one thing. Anybody who's established and sort of felt like the way they've been doing it has worked is ripe for disruption, first of all, but is also not ripe for change. So I think that's true as well. I also think that the longer you have an organization around, you've seen a revolving door of people, and you just see, okay, even the people that we thought were indispensable turned out to be dispensable. And then you get to a place in thinking everybody's dispensable. And if everybody's dispensable, then why are we investing in training or learning and development or culture? Because there's going to be a revolving door of people. Well, that is an awful argument, because ultimately it says that people are just robots, because it sort of says that one person's labor is equal to another person's labor. And I know that that's not true, especially in white collar jobs. So I think the bottom line here is companies that actually don't realize, first of all, go buy that Harvard Business Review article or issue and give it to the leaders, because the beautiful thing about that issue that has the happy face on it from 2012 is it showed empirically that this works. It's not just a good idea, it actually works. So
one last one.
Yep.
A long question. Chip spoke of incentivizing groups of employees, receptionists, maid, barman, and designing a particular perk or aspect of their daily routine which they enjoyed, and applied this unilaterally. Although doing the same job, my team are each driven by different personal drives. How do you deal with this? Yes, the more you try to get granularity in how you're delivering sort of customized perks or
things that inspire the employees, the harder it is to deliver. So I think the best way for me to answer that is, the smaller your company, the more you can customize and literally make it, if you have a consulting firm of 6 people, then and you know that a perk for one employee is having flex time so that they can actually work from home 2 days a week because of children or an aging parent, or I think that you can do more customization a smaller company. The risk in doing customization is if you're a company that has the potential to scale quickly, is you have a grab bag of different incentives, and at some point you may actually have to create some more standardization in that, which means that you might have to take some away. So I would be cautious about getting too customized if it's a tech company that's small, because that will, at some point you'll have to take away. But if you're like a consulting firm, which is less scalable in terms of it's not going to grow to 10 times its size in 3 years, then yes, I think the idea of some customization, and frankly, let's end with this. Ask your employees, what would they like? What would they like if they could actually have some perks that they've seen at other companies? To actually to sort of wrangle it in a little bit, the way you could say it is, what are some perks you've seen at other companies that have worked in other companies that we might consider here? Now, you could, if you want to go a little bit more blue sky, you could say, don't say in other companies. The value in saying in other companies is that you can see if it's worked or not. But sometimes, coming up with an idea that hasn't been done before is the ultimate innovation.
Chip, thank you. So really thoughtful answers, really helpful, useful answers. Your book is now, I think, 2 weeks been available on Amazon.
Correct.
10th anniversary edition. We will also be, we have recorded this, so we'll be running that on the YouTube channel. So we'll be doing that. I think really interesting, since I read the book, this 8-step process is really practical and moves it from being something that you have to really think about to sort of much more usable within a business framework. So that, looking forward to trying to deliver that at my company. I know that we do a lot of what you have suggested in the book already, and we'll try and develop that further. I think that if anybody would like to try and sort of follow up afterwards, we'll be sending out an email, and we'll try and follow up with you if there's any sort of really interesting questions. But just thank you ever so much. Thanks everyone for joining us, whichever part of the world, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Julian.
Thanks so much, Chip. Bye then.